world leaders are convening in Paris this week with ambitions to reimagine the global financing for a new era shaped by climate change as a cascade of crises swamps debt-burdened countries. CNBC Africa spoke to Daouda Sembene, who is in Paris, to get a feel of what will be Africa's key priorities out of this summit.
A number of key issues and challenges facing developing and emerging market countries actually would be addressed. One key issue is how you can help countries restore fiscal space, especially those that are heavily indebted. Another issue is also how you can help promote private sector development in low-income countries. A third issue that was also being addressed is how you can help unlock green infrastructure investment to facilitate the energy transition in emerging market and developing countries. And the fourth and last issue is how you can help also mobilize climate finance for countries that are vulnerable to climate change. So when you look at those critical issues, of course, the idea is how we can find solution and reform that can help unlock additional financing for these emerging market and developing countries to address all of these challenges. And this is the issues that are being debated here. And of course, it involves talking about how multilateral development banks can be reformed to free more resources to help countries, how you can also address the debt burden that many countries are currently facing. And I think this is a key, some of the key expectations that we do have is how we can really find sustainable solution to those challenges that I just mentioned.
African countries are literally sinking in a debt trap. And of course, a number of concerns coming up in regards to how can these countries be further cushioned. At the same time, how does these conversations sit when it comes to reforming some of the institutions such as the IMF, the World Bank, all in a bid towards ensuring that there's equitable financing?
Yes, I think this is a key issue. As you indicated, debt is growing in many developing countries. I think it is estimated that more than half of the low-income countries are now either in debt distress or facing high risk of debt distress. So yes, it is critical to find solution to that critical problem. And I think one of the main issue that needs to be addressed and that is on the agenda of the Paris summit is how you can put in place for those countries that are already in debt distress, how you can put in place an effective debt restructuring mechanism. And of course, there is one that is already existing, which is the common debt framework, but which has not necessarily delivered yet the expected result. So how can it be overhauled? How can it be reformed so that it can be of use for those countries that cannot service any more their debt? You may know that there are countries like Zambia, Ethiopia, and Ghana that ask for treatment under the common debt framework and that are still waiting. We are hoping that as part of this summit, there would be some good news about how the situation in those countries can be sort of addressed, and most importantly, how that reform can take place. But that's not only the debt issue that is important. It is also how you can help countries, low-income countries in general, before they get to into debt distress, to get to have access to low-cost finance that is needed to address those many challenges they are facing, whether it is the challenge of climate change, whether it is the challenge of fragility, poverty, food insecurity, all of those issues that they are conflict, all of those issues that requires them to mobilize more resources, but of course that requires them some time to borrow to address those questions. So how you can help them to have an effective global financial architecture that can facilitate their effort to mobilize resources. Those are issues that are really critical and that are being debated right now in Paris as we stay here, and that we are really hoping that some key announcement would be made so that to give some hope that these issues and challenges that developing countries are facing will be really addressed with the necessary funding that is needed, on both domestically, of course, through resource domestic mobilization, but also with external resources, whether in the form of grant or concessional resources or non-concessional resources.
Daouda, the conversation around climate change continues to dominate the agenda. And for you, what are some of the nitty-gritties that we must not fail to tackle at this summit, especially from an African perspective, considering that climate change adaptation, climate financing, climate mitigation funding has really been lagging behind?
Africa is the region that emit the least greenhouse emissions, but unfortunately that is more vulnerable than any other region to climate change. So how you can help Africa mobilize the resources that it needs to fund its adaptation and mitigation policies is critical, especially the adaptation part. We all know that most of the climate finance flow are going through mitigation and not necessarily adaptation. So African countries has really repeated that they needed more resources for adaptation. So another issue is, of course, the pledge that was made by advanced economies to mobilize $100 billion to help developing countries address those climate change consequences, and which was not yet achieved. So it is also hope that an effort will be made on that. But I think also another critical issue as we speak now is that there is now a push for multilateral institutions, particularly multilateral development banks like the World Bank, to not only work on addressing issues like poverty, but to address global challenges in general. And when people talk about global challenges, they're also talking, of course, about this issue of climate change, but they're also talking about issues like fragility, conflict, and others. So if you ask multilateral development banks to mobilize more resources to address global challenges, you have to make sure that it doesn't come at the expense of the effort they're already making in with regard to the development agenda. The work they're doing to help reduce poverty should not be sort of a sacrifice at the expense of more work on climate. So I think there is a delicate balance and trade-off to be made to make sure that, yes, we do have these institutions address those critical global challenges in general, but they do it in a way that is ensuring complementary. This morning, for instance, there was a discussion where a number of global leaders were participating, and I think it was recognized that the idea is, countries need to both advance their development agenda and also the climate agenda. And the question is how you can make it in a way that is very much that strike the right balance between those very important objectives that are not necessarily competitive, but that needs to be addressed with the necessary resources from development banks, but also from other actors, including the private sector, but also philanthropies.
According to the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, it projects that 3.3 billion people are living in countries where they're spending more of their resources in debt servicing as opposed to investing in critical areas such as agriculture, health, education. What needs to change to tilt the scales?
I think this is a very concerning and worrisome conclusion and finding. So it means that I think there is a problem that needs to be fixed. And that problem, I think, is about how you can address the debt issue in a way that is comprehensive and sustainable. So here you have to distinguish between two types of countries. There are those countries that are already in debt distress. It means that those countries cannot service their debt anymore in a timely manner. And those countries, unfortunately, most of them do not have an effective multilateral debt restructuring mechanism that could help them restore debt sustainability. You need to fix the problem so that those countries can quickly address the debt issue they're facing and restore debt sustainability and be able to grow again. And I think one of the solution that is being proposed is you need to fix the existing common debt framework, which is still not working, and you need to do it by making sure that different creditors that are taking part to the common debt framework, whether it is the multilateral creditors, the private creditors, and also the bilateral creditors, do have incentives to really grant a deal in a timely manner when a country needs it. And a country that is requesting debt treatment under that framework is not penalized by either the credit rating agencies or in sort of other ways and have to wait for more than 1 year or almost 2 years, like in the case of Zambia, to get treatment. I think that needs to be fixed. So for those countries, it is critical to have an effective and functional debt restructuring mechanism. But you should not stop there. You should also think about those countries that are not in debt distress yet, but that may run the risk of going to debt distress if their situation is not improved, if they do not have access to low cost financing. How do you do that? You need also to think about how you can, increase the capacity of multilateral institutions to provide concessional financing. I think that is critical. You also need to think about how you can boost private sector finance by making sure that actors like MDBs and others do have effective tool, whether it's in the forms of guarantees and others, to really give the private sector more incentive to invest in developing countries. I think that's also critical. But also you need to make sure that countries themselves are supported in their effort to sort of mobilize domestic revenue. I think this is a critical way to make sure that we don't have a situation like the one that you're talking about, where countries do have to, unfortunately, sacrifice their social spending because they need to pay off their